Double doors of the Fairmont Chateau conference hall swung open, and every head at the long mahogany table turned. I counted 14 people. 14 people in tailored suits and pearl earrings who had spent the last 6 years pretending I didn't exist. My uncle's lawyer stopped mid-sentence. His reading glasses slid down his nose. The will, my uncle's will, sat open in front of him, pages fanned out like a hand of cards. He looked at me the way people look at a car accident, like he couldn't decide whether to watch or look away. My father recognized me first. I could tell by the way his jaw went tight, the way his hand dropped under the table as if he needed to grip something solid. He hadn't seen me since I was 23. I was 31 now. 8 years is a long time, long enough to become someone he wouldn't recognize if he passed me on the street in Ottawa. Long enough to become someone he should have been afraid of. He wasn't afraid yet. That would come later. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you why I walked into that room knowing exactly what was waiting for me, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to disappear completely, just to survive the people who were supposed to love you? My father's name is not worth saying out loud. In this story, he is just my father. That title is the only thing he ever gave me that I couldn't give back. I grew up in a house outside of Kingston, Ontario. The kind of house that looks warm from the outside, wrap-around porch, gardens my mother kept immaculate, a tire swing in the backyard that nobody ever used because my father said it looked childish. We had money. Not generational wealth, not old money, but the kind of comfortable professional class income that lets a man believe he built something permanent. My father was an estate lawyer. 30 years of managing other people's inheritances. 30 years of deciding who deserved what. You'd think a man who spent his career studying how families tear themselves apart over money would learn something. He didn't. My mother died when I was 19. Ovarian cancer diagnosed in January, gone by October. The kind of loss that moves through you like a demolition crew. It doesn't take everything at once. It just keeps coming back. For years after, I would reach for the phone to call her and remember, in the half second before my fingers unlocked the screen, that she was gone. My father remarried 14 months later. Her name was my stepmother. That's what I'll call her. She had 2 sons from her first marriage. My father adopted them within the year. He didn't tell me. I found out from a cousin at Christmas, the way you find out things in families where you've already been quietly classified as a problem. The reclassification happened slowly, the way it always does. 1 skipped holiday became 2. 2 became a pattern. A pattern became policy. By the time I was 22, the message was clear enough that I stopped needing it explained. I was my mother's daughter. My stepmother needed a clean canvas. My father needed peace. So I gave them what they wanted. I moved to Vancouver. I finished my MBA at UBC. I took a job at a mid-size investment firm, worked 6 years until I understood the industry from the inside out, then left to start my own. We specialize in impact investing, clean energy, affordable housing, social enterprise. It is the kind of work my father would have called soft when I was young. I now manage a portfolio worth more than he will earn in the rest of his life. I didn't do it for him. I did it because I needed something that was entirely mine. I hadn't spoken to my father in 4 years when my uncle's assistant called me. My uncle, my mother's older brother, had been sick for 2 years, pancreatic cancer. He hadn't told me how bad it was because he knew I would fly back and he knew what flying back would cost me. He was protective that way. He was the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen me clearly, not as a piece of a story someone else was telling, but as myself. He died on a Tuesday in early November. The kind of gray Ontario November that makes the whole province feel like it's grieving. His assistant called me that same evening. She told me there would be a formal reading of the estate the following Friday at the Fairmont in downtown Toronto. She said my uncle had requested my presence specifically. She said his lawyers would be in touch. She also told me, almost as an afterthought, that my father would be there. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my apartment in Vancouver for a long time, watching the rain come off the harbor, thinking about my uncle and thinking about what he would have wanted. He would have wanted me there. So I booked a flight. What I didn't tell anyone, what I hadn't told a single person outside of my own legal team, was that 6 weeks before he died, my uncle had called me, not to say goodbye. He'd already said that. He called because he needed me to understand something. He said, "I've been watching what your father has been doing with my accounts. I want you to look at something." He emailed me documents. I forwarded them to my own lawyers in Toronto and to a forensic accountant I trusted. Then I waited. By the time I boarded my flight to Toronto, I had everything I needed. I wore a charcoal suit, Canadian wool. My mother had always said that the right suit was a kind of armor, and I had never forgotten it. The Fairmont conference room smelled like old wood and nervous coffee. My uncle's primary lawyer, a careful, gray-haired man from Mississauga, stood at the head of the table, mid-sentence, when I opened the door. 14 heads turned. My father sat to the right of the lawyer. My stepmother beside him. Her 2 sons, my father's adopted sons, across the table. My uncle's business partner, several of my uncle's longtime friends. A representative from the charitable foundation my uncle had spent 20 years building. My father's face went very still when he saw me. My stepmother leaned toward him and said something I couldn't hear. He didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on me, recalibrating. I walked to the far end of the table and took the empty seat closest to the window. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued. I had made reservations at this hotel under my company name. My assistant had handled all the logistics. Nobody knew I was coming until I was already there. The reading began. My uncle's house in Prince Edward County. To a local land trust. His boat. To his sailing club. His personal library. Individually bequeathed. Name by name. Book by book. Exactly the kind of sentimental specificity that was entirely him. I sat still and let each item land. The room felt like a held breath. My father sat up slightly straighter each time a significant asset was named. He and my uncle had been close, or so my father had always said. My uncle had been the executor of my grandmother's estate. He and my father had done business together for years. Then the lawyer reached the primary estate. My uncle had built a real estate holding company over 30 years, mixed commercial and residential properties, mostly in eastern Ontario. It was worth, conservatively, $4.5 million. The lawyer paused. He looked up. He looked directly at me. My father leaned forward. The residuary estate, the lawyer read, including all holdings of Ramsey Property Group Incorporated, is bequeathed in its entirety to my niece. He said my name. The room went absolutely silent. Then my father pushed back his chair. He didn't shout. My father never shouted in professional settings. He was too good a lawyer for that. He simply stood, slowly, and said, "There must be an error in the document." The lawyer set down the pages. He looked at my father with the calm patience of a man who had anticipated this. "I believe the document is correct," he said. My father turned to me. It was the first time he'd looked at me directly since I'd walked in. "You have no right to be here," he said. His voice was low and measured. "You removed yourself from this family. You abandoned your obligations." I didn't respond. He took that as an invitation to continue. "She left," he said, turning slightly to address the room. "When her stepmother and I needed her most, when we were building a new family, she decided she was too good for us. She moved across the country. She cut off contact, and now she appears here, at my brother-in-law's estate reading, as if she's owed something." I watched him. He had the same quality he'd always had, the ability to sound completely reasonable while saying something deeply cruel. It was his professional gift. He had spent decades using it in courtrooms. My stepmother nodded along. Her sons exchanged a look. My uncle's business partner was watching me. I set my hands flat on the table. "I would like to say something," I said. My father started to speak again. I didn't let him. "You have a pattern," I said, "of describing my departure as a choice. I want to be precise about what actually happened." The room went still. "When I was 22, I said, I came home for Christmas. I found a document on the kitchen table. It was a revised family trust, drawn up by my father, that removed me as a beneficiary of my mother's estate and redirected all remaining assets to my stepmother's household. I was not consulted. I was not notified. I found it by accident." I looked at my father. When I asked him about it, he told me I was being dramatic. He told me I didn't understand estate law, which, at 22, was probably fair. But I understood enough to know that my mother's jewelry, her RRSP proceeds, and the small property she'd left instructions about were gone. I asked him to show me the original will. He told me I didn't need to see it. The charity representative had stopped writing notes. I left, I continued, because there was nothing left for me there. I didn't cut off contact because I was selfish. I cut off contact because staying would have required me to pretend that what he did was acceptable. I wasn't willing to do that. My father's expression hadn't changed. He was still standing. You have no evidence of any of that, he said. I do, actually, I said. I reached into my portfolio case. I placed a document on the table and slid it toward the center. This is an affidavit from my uncle, I said. Signed and notarized 8 weeks ago. In it, he details a series of financial transactions conducted through Ramsey Property Group over the past 11 years, in which funds were directed to my father's personal accounts without authorization from the company's board of directors. He estimated the total at approximately $340,000. The room made a sound, not a gasp, more of a collective intake, a change in pressure. My father's face went very flat. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's not an allegation, I said. It's a documented accounting. My uncle retained a forensic accountant 18 months ago. The report is complete. Copies have already been filed with the Law Society of Ontario and with my uncle's estate solicitors. My stepmother touched my father's arm. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at me, and then he reached inside his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it on the table in front of him and turned it so the room could see it. It was a handwritten letter on my uncle's personal stationery. He's retracting it, I thought. He's prepared for this. This, my father said, his voice recovering some of its courtroom steadiness, is a letter from your uncle, written to me 2 weeks before he died, in which he confirms that the transactions in question were loans authorized verbally and that he had no intention of pursuing legal action. He slid it toward the center of the table. I looked at the letter. I could see my uncle's handwriting. I knew it well. The slight leftward lean, the way he crossed his T's. The signature at the bottom was wrong. I have known my uncle's signature since I was a child. He signed everything the same way. First initial, last name, the kind of consistent, practiced signature that doesn't change in 30 years. The signature on that letter was his full first name written out. He never signed that way. Not once. I didn't say any of that out loud. I looked at my father. He read my silence as hesitation. He straightened. He said, I think we can all agree that what happened in this family was painful. But producing a forensic accounting of old loans and calling in personal grievances at an estate reading is not the behavior of someone acting in good faith. It is the behavior of someone looking for a settlement. He looked around the table. I want to suggest, he said, that we agree to a mediated process. That we step back from whatever has been filed and handle this the way my brother-in-law would have wanted, as a family. My uncle's business partner said, quietly, I don't think that's what Ramsey would have wanted. My father glanced at him. I reached into my portfolio case a second time. I placed a USB drive on the table. My uncle had a habit of recording his phone calls, I said. It's something he started during the pandemic when so much business moved to phones. He was methodical about it, kept digital backups going back 6 years. The room was completely silent, including, I said, a call made to my father 13 months ago, in which my father requested a transfer of funds from the property group to a personal account in his name, and my uncle said no. Clearly, my father's lawyer, a younger man sitting beside him who had been quiet until now, put his hand on my father's arm. My father didn't sit down, but the posture changed. Something went out of him. The way air goes out of a room when a window opens. That letter, I said, nodding toward the document he had produced, was not written by my uncle. I'd stake everything I have on that. And I think the Law Society will find it very interesting, given that you drew it up yourself. He said, you can't prove that. I said, I don't have to prove it today. That's what investigations are for. The room had shifted entirely. My uncle's business partner was already on his phone. The charity representative was speaking quietly to a colleague. My stepmother's sons had stopped looking at me and started looking at the table. My father stood very still at the end of the table. I looked at him. Not with anger. I had moved through anger somewhere over the Rockies on the flight out. What I felt was something colder and cleaner. The feeling of a thing finally being named correctly. You spent 11 years, I said, quietly enough that only he could hear, managing my uncle's trust in his estate and redirecting what didn't belong to you. And you spent 8 years telling yourself and everyone who would listen that I left because I was difficult, because I was my mother's daughter and I couldn't adapt. He didn't speak. I said, but the reason you needed me gone, the real reason, is that I was the one person who knew what my mother's estate actually contained, and you couldn't falsify those records with me watching. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. I said, I'm not doing this for the inheritance. I already have more than I need. I'm doing this because my uncle asked me to. Because he spent his last months trying to fix what you broke. And because I am done letting you describe what happened to me as a choice I made. I gathered my documents. I stood up. The estate will be administered through the solicitors, I said to the room. Anyone with questions can speak to them directly. The forensic accounting and the USB recording have already been submitted. I expect the Law Society process to take several months. I looked at my father one last time. He looked old. Not the old of a man who has lived well and earned his years. The old of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally had it taken away from him. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. I felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to say so out loud. I walked out of the Fairmont conference room without looking back. The elevator was waiting. The lobby smelled like pine and wood smoke. Outside, Toronto was doing its gray November thing, the kind of cold that gets into your collar regardless of what you're wearing. I stood on Front Street and called my uncle's assistant. I told her it was done. She cried. I didn't. Not then. That came later, alone in my hotel room, watching the lake go dark outside the window. Grief doesn't observe convenient timing. I cried for my uncle, who had carried this for 2 years without telling me how sick he was. I cried for my mother, who had made her choices carefully and watched them undone. I cried a little, I think, for the 22-year-old who had found that document on the kitchen table and had not had the resources or the knowledge to do anything about it but leave. She'd had to wait 8 years for the right moment. That's a long time to be patient. The Law Society investigation took 7 months. My father's license to practice was suspended pending review. His name was removed from the Ontario Bar Registry the following spring. My stepmother filed for divorce 4 months into the process. I don't know whether to blame her or understand her, and I've decided I don't need to do either. With the estate settled, I used a portion of my uncle's holdings to do something he had mentioned to me years ago on a long drive through Prince Edward County when I was maybe 16. And the world seemed like a straightforward place. He'd pointed to an old farmhouse and said, someone should turn that into something useful for young people who don't have anywhere to go. It took some work. Zoning approvals, partners, funding applications. But by the following autumn, the property was operating as a transitional housing program for young adults in the Kingston area who had aged out of foster care or been separated from their families. We called it after my mother's middle name. My father sent me a letter the month the center opened. I don't know what was in it. I didn't open it. I gave it to my lawyer and asked her to document its receipt and keep it filed. Some doors, once closed, are closed for a reason. My uncle used to say that the best revenge is becoming something your enemies can't ignore. I don't entirely agree. I think the best revenge is becoming something that has nothing to do with them anymore. Something so rooted in your own purpose that their opinion of it is simply irrelevant. I had a father once. He was also an estate lawyer who understood, better than most, how families are unmade. He taught me that inheritance isn't just money. It's the accumulation of every choice a person makes about who matters and who doesn't. My mother chose me. My uncle chose me. That is the only inheritance that has ever mattered. And the rest I built myself, from a studio apartment in Vancouver and an MCAT score and 6 years of 14-hour days and a particular kind of fury that I learned, eventually, to turn into something useful. He tried to erase me. He just didn't account for what erasure does to certain kinds of people. It doesn't hollow them out. It makes them meticulous. It makes them patient. It makes them wait, very quietly, for the moment when the truth finally has a room to speak in. Friday at the Fairmont, the room was ready. So was I. I've thought a lot about what my uncle said to me on that drive through Prince Edward County, back when I was 16, and the world still felt like a place that made sense. He pointed at an old farmhouse along the county road and said someone should do something useful with it for young people who had nowhere to go. I thought he was just making conversation. He wasn't. He was already thinking ahead. He was always thinking ahead, quietly, without needing credit for it. That's the thing about people who are genuinely decent. They don't announce it. They just keep doing the thing, year after year, until the moment arrives when it matters. My father was the opposite. He was a man who needed witnesses. He needed the room to see him performing grief, performing generosity, performing the role of the wronged patriarch. Everything he did was for the audience. And when there was no audience, when it was just him and a set of documents and a decision about what was fair, that's when you saw what he actually was. I used to think his treatment of me was personal. When I was 22 and I found that amended trust on the kitchen table, I spent weeks trying to understand what I had done. What quality in me had made it so easy for him to simply remove me? I went through it obsessively. The way you go through a relationship after it ends, looking for the moment you missed. But it wasn't personal. That's the part that took me years to understand. I wasn't erased because of anything I did or failed to do. I was erased because I was inconvenient to a version of the future he was already building. A version that had my stepmother at the center and no complicated reminders of my mother at the edges. I was inconvenient, so he solved me the way he solved other inconvenient things. Quietly, with paperwork, and without explanation. The mistake he made was assuming that erasure is permanent. What I know now, that I didn't know at 22, is that resilience isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the decision, made quietly and without ceremony, to keep going anyway. To build something anyway. To become, slowly and without his permission, someone he had no framework for. And intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that actually protects you, isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about knowing which room to walk into and when, and with what in your hands when you get there. My uncle taught me that. He spent 2 years building a case he knew he wouldn't live to see completed. He did it anyway because he understood that truth has a longer timeline than any individual's patience. I don't think my father will ever understand what he actually cost himself. Not the money, not the license. Those are consequences, not costs. The real cost is something quieter. He spent 30 years becoming a man whose children, biological and adopted, watched him be arrested for fraud and felt primarily relieved. That's not a legal outcome. That's a life's work in a direction he chose, one small decision at a time. I think about the young people who sleep at the center we built in Prince Edward County. I think about what it means to have a door that is always open and always lit. My uncle wanted that. My mother, I think, would have wanted that. And the 22-year-old who drove away from Kingston with nothing, and the 31-year-old who drove back with everything she needed, I needed to build it too. For reasons I'm still figuring out. Some inheritances skip a generation. Some arrive exactly on time.